so we may as well start with prayer, because I know I need it. But anyways, Heavenly Father, thank you so much for everybody who's here. I pray, Lord, that you would bless us tonight, and that we would come away learning something, and that you would help us to remember, Lord, that context always makes a difference when we're reading your word, and that history is your story, and so there's always benefit to learning the history of anything, because it always has your fingerprints and it always bears your hand. I pray, God, that you would be with us tonight, be in this room, be in my mind, be in my mouth, Father. Let me say nothing except that which will glorify you. In Jesus' name I ask this, and I give the night over to you. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so, what evil has he done? The idea for talking about this came out of a paper, a research paper that I had to write, and I was quite fascinated to find that there's a whole lot more to Pilate's story than we typically hear in the church. Not in the sense that people are trying to leave things out for us, but in the sense that we deal with Pilate through the Gospels, we deal with Pilate through the accounts of the trials. And we don't necessarily look at the so-called non-canonical sources, the sources outside of the Bible that also talk about him. So the idea, and you know, you hear, I don't know how many people here may have had people come up to them and say, oh, the Gospels are all fine and well, and they're all very interesting, but they're not really history. The writers of the Gospel weren't actually writing real history, and they weren't too concerned with the facts. And that in some sense you get the impression from people all the time that the Gospels and history are two separate things. And history is far more reliable, as though the Gospels were not history. Okay? So I kind of wanted to address tonight this idea of looking at what the non-canonical sources say about Pilate, what they can tell us about Pilate, and then put him back into the Gospels and look at what the Gospel writers have told us about the trial. And can we find that historical picture that we have seen in the non-canonical sources? Do the Gospels line up with that picture? And if they do, and you've got to start saying to yourself, well, hey, gee, maybe these guys knew what they were writing about. Maybe they know exactly that they're recording exact history, and that you can see the historical Pilate, so-called historical Pilate, in the Gospels. Okay? So that's what we're starting with. How do I do this though? There we go. I'm not very technologically. All right. So the three main sources that we have in terms of information about Pilate are a gentleman named Philo of Alexandria, who is a Jewish man. Another fellow who's quite famous, Flavius Josephus, and of course the four Gospels. Those are, and of course Acts as well, but Acts was written by Luke, so kind of, and since it was originally one book altogether, we put that in with the Gospels. And tonight we won't be dealing with Acts per se. We're going to be dealing mainly with the trial narratives. All right, all of these are first century documents written by first century people living during the time of Christ, during the time of the events. All right, so just introduction to those. First author we want to talk about is Philo. So he was an Alexandrian Jew, which means he lived in Alexandria in Egypt, between 20 BC and 50 AD. He was a philosopher, very well educated, an interpreter of Jewish scripture. Okay, that is what he was famous for. He went on. He became the Jewish representative on an embassy sent to Gaius Caligula. You might remember the name of the Roman Emperor Caligula, in 40 AD. He went on this embassy, he went to see Caligula because Caligula was talking about erecting a statue of himself in Jerusalem. And Philo is also part of an ongoing civil strife situation in Alexandria at the time between the Greeks and the Jews in that city. And so he goes as the Jewish representative on a particular group of people to speak to Caligula about, please don't put up a statue in Jerusalem of yourself. That's not a good idea. And also to give the Jewish perspective on the strife that's been going on between the Greeks and the Jews in Alexandria at that time. He records the events of the embassy to Caligula, and he writes them in what's called the Embassy to Gaius. It was written sometime between 40 and 50 AD. Okay, he's extremely politically savvy. And he critiques Roman governors and Roman officials according to how he perceives they have treated the Jews. Okay, that's his standard by which he judges them. And it's important when you read his work to understand that he's writing in the context of trying to convince the emperor not to make a foolish decision and upset the Jews. And he does this by arguing about the good Roman leaders who looked after the Jews and did things the right way, and the bad Roman leaders who didn't look after the Jews and didn't do things the right way. And Caligula, you don't want to be lumped with them. Okay? He's kind of playing a bit of a game. But his record of the events is in the embassy to Gaius. Okay? So he judges Roman rulers with a particular perspective. Second author we're going to look at is Flavius Josephus, famous guy. He's actually Jewish. He was born Yosef ben Matityahu. He was born in 37 AD, lived to 100 AD. This guy had quite the life. He says he was trained as a Pharisee. Maybe true. We do know for a fact he was a Galilean governor. And he was also a rebel freedom fighter in the First Jewish War in 67 AD. During the course of fighting in that war, he became very obvious to him that the Romans were going to win. And so he surrendered to Vespasian, who was the general during that war, the Roman general that was in charge of the Roman forces at that time. Vespasian later became an emperor. But he surrenders to Vespasian, and Vespasian realizes this guy's really educated. This guy's quite gifted and talented. This guy could be of benefit to have in my back pocket. And so Vespasian somewhat adopts Josephus. And Josephus actually takes Vespasian's family name, which is Flavius, which is how you get Flavius Josephus, which was his name in Latin. He then later advises Vespasian's son, Titus. Titus is the one who leads the siege against Jerusalem in 70 AD when the city falls and the temple is destroyed. Josephus is with him. Josephus is advising him. Okay? So keep a perspective on Josephus here. He's perceived by his own people as a bit of a traitor. Romans do have some respect for him, though. He writes the Jewish Wars, and he writes the Antiquities of the Jews, and he has a specific purpose for it. He writes in order to explain to the Romans the reasons for the Jewish rebellion, the reasons why the Jews can't abide living under Roman rule. Okay? So he walks a fine line in the way that he writes his work. He's giving the background and the explanation for the Jews' behavior, but at the same time, trying not to be too harsh and judgmental against the Romans either. Okay? He's kind of buttering his bread on both sides, really. Okay? He was originally considered by a lot of scholars to be a very creative author with his facts, but in actual fact, archaeology has proved him within the last century or so to be remarkably accurate in his description of events, his geographical knowledge, his understanding of political things that were going on at the time. So that's Josephus. And he is another source for Pilate. Then of course you've got Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Okay, the gospel writers. So this is just basic information based on what I kind of took a survey of scholars. I didn't go with any one specific one, and kind of grouped together a general view. Because man, if you start talking to different biblical scholars, you're going to get all kinds of different stories. All right, so Mark, as we all know, companion to Peter and Paul. His account is based on Peter's teaching, Peter's preaching. His gospel is likely the first gospel in circulation. Possibly Matthew's might have been first, depending on how you look at it. Somewhere between 45 and 70 AD, depending on the scholar you look at. Matthew, tax collector, one of the 12. His gospel is generally thought to be the second or the third, depending on how you look at it. Dated 55 to 90 AD. Luke, physician, companion to Paul. He writes Luke Acts between 65 and 90 AD. John, fisherman, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, likely the last gospel or the latest gospel, written between 80 and 90 AD. It depends, please, please, please. It just depends on the scholar you look at, okay? Each gives a distinct portrait. Each is grounded with historical markers. Okay? All right. So those are your authors that we're looking at. Getting a grip on the history. Okay, I don't know how many people have running shoes on, but this is going to be me running through centuries of history. Okay, to get you to the point that Pilate comes into the picture. All right? So, when the Old Testament ends, the Persian Empire is the one that we're dealing with. And it remains the Persian Empire until 334 BC. Then along comes Alexander the Great. And the idea of Hellenization, making everything into a harmonized Greek culture. He rules until 323 BC. When he dies, he has no heir, so his empire is divided between his generals. The Ptolemies, or Ptolemy, one of his generals, takes the area that is Egypt, and he also takes the territory that would include the Holy Lands. Excuse me. Under the Ptolemies, Israel enjoys fairly tolerant rule. Okay? The Ptolemies rule until 198 BC. Then the Seleucids, descendants of one of the other generals of Alexander, they take over in the Holy Land. And everything is fairly tolerant then too, until you hit Antiochus IV. Not so tolerant. So much so that there is an uprising. This is the famous rebellion of the Maccabees. Okay? And with the rebellion of the Maccabees, the Seleucids are thrown off, and there is an Israel that is independent for a little over a century. Okay? A little over a century, Israel enjoys its own independence for the first time in a very, very long time, under the Hasmonean dynasty. Okay? This is an important period because for the first time, the role of the high priest in the temple is linked to political power. Okay? High priest in the Old Testament, not about political power. They hold the position for life, and they are concerned with Israel's spiritual life, right? They advise the king, obviously, they have that role, but they are not kings themselves. In this case, under the Hasmonean dynasty, the king is also the high priest. So this is a very important idea to understand. High priest and king. Faith and politics are now linked. They will remain so. Okay? So, then comes the civil war at the end of the Hasmonean dynasty. And it's so sticky and so bad and goes so wrong and is causing so many problems in the area that Pompey the Great, the Roman general, ends up going in and saying, look, I'm settling this problem. This is how it's going to go down. Israel is now a client of Rome. Not exactly a province, a client of Rome. But Rome is going to appoint the king, and Rome is going to appoint the high priest. And that's the way it's going to stay. Okay? They appoint a king, it's Antipater. They appoint a high priest, and off we go. Julius Caesar's on campaign a few years later, and Julius Caesar needs some help, needs some money, needs some supplies for his soldiers. The Jews are very kind, they help him. As a result, Julius Caesar rewards the Jewish people. And he does this by legally recognizing their faith and making it a religio licitas. That means that they have special privileges to honor and to worship in the way that they normally would under Roman rule. Not everybody got this. It's very, very unusual to be given this kind of privilege. Okay? So, Julius Caesar is the one who gives the Jews that. All right? Antipater dies. Guess what? There's another power struggle. Antipater's son, Herod, becomes the king. This is Herod the Great, okay, that we hear about starting in the New Testament, right? This is Herod the Great. He takes the throne in 37 AD. He is king for a little over 30 years. All right? He is the king at the time that Jesus is born. All right?
37 BC.
37 AD. Oh, so yeah, BC, sorry. Sorry. It's a typo, you're correct. So he is king for approximately 33, 34 years, depending on who you read. He dies somewhere around 4 BC. There's another power struggle. Okay? So much so that a whole group of people go to Rome and say to Augustus, formerly Octavian, Caesar Augustus, and say, look, we can't settle this, who's going to be king? So he decides, all right, we're going to divide the territory up. There's going to be 4 rulers. That's why you get the word tetrarch, okay? He divides territory into 4, puts 4 rulers over it. Okay, so Antipas, Herod Antipas, is given Galilee, and Archelaus is given Judea, where Jerusalem is located. All right, there's also a sister of Herod and her son. They're given another territory, and then there's Philip as well. Anyways, for the point and purposes of what we're talking about, Archelaus is given Judea. All right, so clearly Rome is basically in control. Rome is making the decisions. Rome is putting the people on the throne. Rome is settling the disputes. Archelaus, now you got to think to yourself, how cruel does somebody have to be on the throne for Rome to physically remove them? Okay? How cruel do you have to be? Archelaus is so cruel to the Jews that the Romans remove him from the throne. And they say, that's enough of that. 6 AD, Judea becomes an official Roman province, and a prefect is installed to rule over Rome, to rule over Judea. Okay? That is when the beginning of the prefects happens. All right, so we have just run through the whole intertestamental period. Okay, and on we go. All right, prefect's job. I say prefect because we now understand, I don't know, growing up you probably heard procurator, governor, all of these words. And in many of our New Testament translations it uses the term governor. It's still accurate. Procurator is actually a more financially based position in Rome at this time. Later, governors became called procurators. At this point, prefect was the most commonly used phrase. And we have archaeological evidence of this. So the reason why I am calling Pilate a prefect is because that is what he is named himself as in his own inscription. Okay? All right, so prefect's duties. You must rule in cooperation with the local elite. Rome's policy was, yes, you're going to take over. Yes, Rome is the ultimate authority. But where possible, to keep the peace and cost Rome less money, leave the day-to-day running of things in the hands of the local elite, whomever they are. All right? Usually that includes somewhat religious freedom. Of course, the occasional add-on to that is that you must also, add in the emperor's cult. But generally, you can still go on and worship your own gods. We're just going to add a few in there. But you must rule in cooperation with the local elite. That is the most logical way to handle things day to day. Your first job, keep the peace. Wars are expensive. Okay? They're expensive, yes, in men, but they are expensive in money. And they cause additional domino problems when you have unrest in certain territories. Other job for a prefect, you must collect the taxes. Make sure what's supposed to go back to Rome gets back to Rome. Other jobs that a prefect is expected to do. All public works and building projects, repairs, all those kinds of things. Improvements, Roman architecture, Roman technology being brought into areas that would not have normally had it. This is the job of the prefect. He oversees these things. He puts these projects in place. Okay? Obviously, you are to enforce the emperor's decrees. And you are to honor him and to promote his cult. These also are part of your responsibilities. And of course, you are to administer justice. When I say justice, I mean Roman justice. Roman laws, Roman way of doing things. So that would include execution of Rome's enemies. Okay? There's your prefect's duties. All right, what you see, we're getting close to Pilate. Don't worry, we're getting there. All right. The high priest under Rome. Remember we talked about the fact that way back, high priest joined with politics, right? Became a political thing as well as a religious thing. All right. High priests were appointed by Rome. They reported to the Judean governor to some degree. Okay? The Judean governor could remove the high priest if necessary. if he felt that he was in some way not doing his job. And it happened. Interesting thing to note, Caiaphas is the high priest for almost the entire, actually for the entire duration of Pilate's rule. That tells you something, okay? It tells you that Caiaphas and Pilate worked well together. They worked very well together. They were able to make the system successful, okay? The high priest governs the Sanhedrin and the temple economy. And ladies and gentlemen, it was an economy by this point in time in Judea. The sacrificial system, the tithing, the money changing, all of it. It's an actual economy that comes out of the temple at this point. All right? The high priest was usually chosen from a limited pool of families. Generally, we have record about 2 or 3 for the most part. And it sort of moved around within those families. Okay? As we know, Annas and Caiaphas, both listed as high priests in the New Testament, they were actually father-in-law and son-in-law. Caiaphas was the son-in-law to Annas. In the Old Testament, high priesthood was supposed to be a lifetime, position. It's not that way anymore under Rome. And they are responsible, the high priest, part of his political responsibility in terms of working in tandem with the Roman rule, he also has a concern to keep that favored status for the Jewish people. Keep that favored status, because being a religiositas means that the temple and the sacrificial system and the ruling under the Jewish law can continue to exist and to not be challenged or to not be taken away from them by Rome. And there's been enough situations in the centuries before where this has happened to the Jews. And so the high priest has an actual concern to be able to walk the fine line, keep peace, keep Rome happy, and keep the special privileges that the Jews have. Okay? Not an easy thing to do. Part of the problem. And of course, let's be honest, he also wants to keep the favor within those families, those elite families that the high priest is chosen from. All right. The high priest and the Jewish leaders could appeal to the Syrian governor. His next big territory outside of Judea is the Syrian governor. He's the one who has the legions of soldiers, by the way. Pilate has a group of auxiliary troops, but if he was ever in real trouble, the legions are a fair distance away, and they would have to be contacted and brought in, all right? And those legions are under the Syrian governor. Technically, the Syrian governor is the next guy up to Pilate. Okay? All right, so the Syrian governor, if the Jewish leaders, for some reason, felt that the Judean governor had broken laws of Rome, had done something that Rome wouldn't approve of, had done something that the emperor would not approve of, they had the right to send an embassy to the Syrian governor and complain. If the complaint was legitimate, the Syrian governor could officially send that complaint to Rome itself, and the emperor would act. Okay? That would be a very sticky situation for the Judean governor, let me tell you. All right? Not a lot of Judean governors lasted very long in the list when you look at it. 2 years, thereabouts. Tiberius, the man who appointed Pilate, actually had a policy. He wanted governors to stay in power for longer than that, and the reason why he did was because he figured when they first get in power, they're going to be trying to make themselves rich. But if they stay in power long enough, that will sort of fade away. They won't need to be doing that anymore, and then they'll actually govern responsibly. So he didn't want this high turnover. Okay? Anyways, so this is the high priest under Rome. These are all part of his responsibility. And this would also, of course, to some degree be shared with the other Jewish leaders. All right. Where do your prefects come from? How do you get chosen to be a governor? All right, there's 4 levels to the society in Rome. There's your patricians. These are your founding families, your aristocracy. There's your equestrian class. We would call them knights. That's sometimes what they're called. Generally, they're property owners, so they have some property, farms, perhaps. Usually, the equestrian order would serve as lifetime military. Okay, they would go into the legions when they were young, buff men, and they would have a career, work their way up and then be retired with a piece of land somewhere that they had served. Okay, and then you had your plebeians. Okay, we get that phrase for a reason. It comes out of Latin. These were the commoners, the everyday Joes. Probably didn't own property. Then you had your slaves, no rights whatsoever. The prefects and the governors, when you start dealing with the republic, originally a prefect or a governor would have been appointed as they would be a retired consul. So the two highest positions in the Roman government were the consuls. The two consuls, when they were done being consul, they had a limited term, just like we do in our elections. They would be retired and given a nice, juicy, fat, rich province to govern. That was their reward. Later, it was opened up to senators. Accomplished retired senators, they could also be appointed governors. Usually a province was a reward of some kind. Then it moved down a little bit more. Generals, but only certain generals, generals that were declared imperators on the field by their own men. So they would have accomplished some great victory of some kind. Their own men would give them a brass crown. They would give them the title imperator. When they returned to Rome, they would be rewarded by the Senate with a province to govern. Okay? By Pilate's time, this had dropped down a little bit more. And now, accomplished military leaders in general could potentially become governors. And it was looked at as a goal. If you could achieve success on the battlefield and get ingratiated with the emperor or ingratiated with the Senate, you could be appointed a province. Then you could get rich. You could end up with territory. You could end up with land. You could end up with wealth. You could then retire to Rome when you were done governing your province and be a whole heck of a lot higher up in the class system than you were when you started as a legionary. Okay? So this is the way you get to your governors. All right. Judea. Quite often when you read about Judea, you hear the phrase, well, it was an inconsequential province. It really wasn't that important strategically. It really wasn't that big of a deal to be in Judea. You know, it was a bit of a headache. Well, for a little province, it was an awfully big headache. And it wasn't quite as strategically insignificant as what you often read it to be. And the reason why is this. The Judean territory lay between Syria and Egypt, two of Rome's most important provinces. Okay? Syria was the province that was their defense, their bulwark against the Parthians, whom they had never been able to defeat. This is Rome, ladies and gentlemen. They had never been able to defeat the Parthians. The border between the Parthians and the Eastern Empire is Syria. If there is unrest in Judea and it spreads to Syria, and Syria's legions are tied up trying to stop the unrest in Judea, guess what border is less defended? The border with the Parthians. That's a problem. Okay? All right, it's also a bottlenecked territory to the Judean area. Okay? In terms of transport, it was a bottleneck territory. It was also a bottleneck territory. If you have a whole territory that is in revolt, and people can't get through, and they have to take a long way around, communication between the eastern part of the Roman Empire and the western part of the Roman Empire can be delayed considerably. If you've got soldiers trying to be mobilized, that's not a good thing. You don't want that, okay? You don't want to have to take extra time by sending everything by ship. You don't want to take extra time, okay? So you want to have that territory left open, not revolting, okay? Also, it would restrict the transport of Egypt's grain to Rome. Quite often when you read history about this time period, you'll hear Egypt referred to as Rome's breadbasket. It's where all the grain that fed the empire came from. All right, that's why Octavian annexed it. That's why it was so important to Mark Antony. That's why it was so important to Julius Caesar. Okay? So, anything that's going to restrict the transport of that grain results in riots and revolts wherever the grain isn't getting, because people are hungry and they get mad. And it was not unusual in Rome to have riots and revolts because of a shortage of grain. Okay? So, no emperor wanted that headache. So having that territory nice and clean and clear and under control, very helpful. Okay? All right. Also, another problem, the local elite were not separate from the religion in Judea, the local elite were the religious leaders. So any Roman governor who wanted to be in that territory, was trying to keep peace in that territory, had no choice but to deal with the religious issues of that territory. Rome didn't like that. That was sticky. That got messy. It was a problem. Okay? Also, you have a territory, reputation for being very contentious, a territory sandwiched between Syria and Egypt, a territory that is important, a territory that must be kept peaceful, but you have under 3,000 troops to do it in. You have limited funds, you have a limited staff, okay? And you are a heck of a long way away from Rome. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is, great potential to make a name for yourself as a governor. You don't necessarily want to end up the governor of someplace like Judea, because it's a little place, but it's a big headache, okay? And we know from the history that it was constantly contentious. There was always a problem. Power struggles galore, all right? So, good old Tiberius, second emperor, he appoints Pilate. This is not actually what Pilate looked like, in case you're wondering. This is some artist's sculpture representation of him, but it was the only picture I could find that wasn't like some famous Hollywood actor looking very scowly. Anyway, so Tiberius, who's the guy over here on the left, he appoints Pilate. We don't know what Pilate did. Pilate must have done something, okay? Accomplished something. He appoints Pilate to be a governor. Pilate's going, yay, yippee skippy, I've made it, I'm going to be a governor. And then he gets told, you're going to govern Judea. And I don't know, maybe Pilate wasn't all that thrilled, who knows. Anyway, 26 AD, he arrives. He serves for 10 years. Pilate remains the longest serving governor of the province. And Caiaphas remains the longest serving high priest of this period. Again, interesting. These two men work very well together. All right? Pilate is of the equestrian order. This means he is a military man. He is not a politician. He is not a philosopher. He is a military man. He probably had a reputation for being able to get tough jobs done. I mean, I don't imagine that Tiberius just pulled his name out of the air. He probably thought, you know what? This is a tough area. It needs a strong hand. Sticking Pilate in there. That's what I'm going to do. High priest is Caiaphas, as we talked about. The governor's residence was not in Jerusalem. The Roman governor's residence was in Caesarea. Okay? Caesarea Maritima, which was a town built by Herod the Great. All right, so that's where the governor's general residence is. Antipas at this point is the tetrarch who's ruling over Galilee. All right? And Pilate is only in Jerusalem during the high feasts. Okay? When the population of Jerusalem swells immensely, that's when Pilate is in Jerusalem. And when he's there, he stays in Herod's old palace in Jerusalem. Okay? So now I've set you up. We've gotten to Pilate now. Here we go. All right. Pilate's record. Now, we're stepping outside of the Gospels here, and we are talking about the Roman record of Pilate. Philo writes about Pilate's behavior, and Josephus writes about Pilate's behavior. And he has 4 little run-ins during his time as governor that we know about. Probably more, perhaps, but 4 major ones. And here's how it goes. Pilate is appointed. Pilate has all the duties and responsibilities we talked about, one of which is honor the emperor, promote his cult. Okay? Pilate wants to make a name for himself. He wants to be shown to be strong, tough, firm hand. I got this. So he hears about the contentious issues in Judea. And the standards, does anybody here know what a Roman standard is? Do you know what the Roman standards were? No? Okay. So each group of soldiers, each legion had its own standard, its own symbol. It was a long pole, had a symbol on the top, had some, whatever the image was that represented that legion. Okay? It was very important, had eagle on the top usually, which symbolized Rome. Usually red cloth of some kind attached to it. Similar to, you know, when you see pictures like in the War of Independence in the States, you know, there's that little guy who's running ahead with the flag at the head of the army. Similar idea. The ones who bore the standards, carried the standards into battle, very important. Okay, it was a position of honor. All right, so he has his group of auxiliary troops that he's bringing with him into Judea to make his name, to make his mark. And he decides that under the cover of darkness, I've got these lovely standards, and attached to my standards from my auxiliary troops is a beautiful bust of the emperor. That'll honor him. That's great. It's a lovely portrait of the emperor. It's on my standards. Under the cover of darkness, I'll take that into Jerusalem, and we'll plunk them down, and we'll take them into the holy city. And boo, I'm making a statement. Tiberius rules here, baby. And I am the guy that Tiberius picked. He does it under cover of darkness because he's heard that there might be a problem with this idea. Why? Busts of the emperor in the holy city. This is a breaking of Jewish law. And the Jews have special privileges. They are religio licitatis. These kinds of issues cause problems. He does it under cover of darkness. All right? Only the group that's going to be in the Antonian fortress, but their standards are now on display in Jerusalem. Pilate is holed up in Caesarea, takes possession of the governor's home. He's there. Daylight dawns. The Jewish religious leaders and the Jewish people get a hold of these standards. And they say, oh, no, 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 no. No, 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 this is not happening. We are not happy about this. Send a whole group of Jewish people. In fact, over 5 days, a ton of people make their way to Caesarea, end up in Caesarea protesting to Pilate in the governor's residence. It's a peaceful protest. They're no better than to be violent about it. And he doesn't strike back. He doesn't fight. He doesn't argue. 5 days it goes on. They're camped outside his residence. And they start at dawn with their protesting and complaining. And I suppose we could picture it in terms of modern days chanting, whatever they're doing, right? And he lets this go for 5 days. He speaks to the representatives and they say, you've got to take those standards out. He's like, I can't. I have made a public declaration to honor the emperor. If I go and take those standards back, I look like a fool. I look like I'm going back on honoring the emperor. I'm not doing it. It's part of my job. My job is to honor him and to promote the cult. So I don't care what you're mad about. I'm not removing those standards, because it's going to make me look bad, and that's going to get back to Rome. And I'm just starting out here in Judea. I don't want a bad reputation going back to Rome. He says, I'm not removing them. They keep on going. So, Pilate, relatively new to the province, he sends his soldiers out among the crowds. And at a prearranged signal, they pull out their swords, and they put their swords at the throats of the protesters. They don't kill them, but it's a symbol of power. We will kill you if you don't pack up your stuff, stop the protesting, and go home. The Jews, on the other hand, open their clothes and hold their necks up. Lay themselves down and hold their necks up. Go right ahead. We would rather die than leave those standards in Jerusalem. Pilate has a choice. He's standing watching this, and he's completely taken aback. Okay, maybe I misjudged. I don't want my first act to be a slaughter, a massacre. Not only that, but they're not even trying to fight me. It's going to make me look bad. And if the emperor is going to get mad about the standards being removed, how much more mad is he going to be if what I do is create a slaughter or a massacre? Stands down the soldiers, removes them, and agrees to take the standards out of Jerusalem. All right, second problem. One of his jobs is to do public works, building projects, right? Improve conditions, bring Roman technology, all of those things. What does he do? He wants to extend the aqueducts, bring them further into Jerusalem so that there's more water available, cleaner water, better water, etc. Sounds great. Great idea. Unfortunately, you need money to do this. And Pilate thinks to himself, well, the temple's got money. The temple's loaded. And it's right in the middle of Jerusalem. Why? What's the big deal? Why can't I just take some of the money out of the treasury of the temple and use that to build the aqueducts? It's going to help everybody. It's going to serve everybody. It's a great idea. And it's part of my job. Public works. I will have a reputation for bringing good things to Jerusalem. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing to note, however, is the one person that does not object to this is Caiaphas. There is no historical record of the high priests, the chief priests, or the rulers of the temple objecting to him taking this money. The people object. The people are right ticked off. The people are mad. The people protest. Okay? So the people protest, and they argue and fight, and they say to him, look, you can't take that money. We don't want this aqueduct. We don't care if you're taking the money from the temple. Get rid of it. We don't want it. Put the money back in the temple. You can't touch that money. It doesn't belong to you. Pilate's frustrated. He gives up. He backs off. Can't build the aqueduct now either. Okay? Second thing he's tried, he's run up against trouble. He's basically had to back down. All right. So, he puts in, during the protest, however, he sends his soldiers among the people dressed in robes like the Jews. And under their robes, they have clubs. And he says, look, you gotta disperse, go home, let it go. And they don't disperse, go home, and let it go. So at a prearranged signal, he says, get rid of the rioters. Not all the people. Do not club everybody. Just take out the ringleaders. Unfortunately, his soldiers are not quite so kind of forgiving. And they just go at it with anybody that happens to be nearby. Many Jews are killed. They're beaten to death. Problem 2 that Pilate has dealt with. Okay? All right, next of his 4 conflicts. By the way, here's what standards look like. It's kind of a cartoony picture, but you can see here how a bust of the emperor could be placed inside the standards, right? And over here we have an aqueduct, of course. These are ruins of aqueducts in Caesarea. All right, Pilate's record 4 conflicts. Here's another one. Philo tells us that Pilate, to annoy the multitudes, but keep in mind he's judging according to how Roman rulers treat the Jews, and he's trying to show examples to Caligula of bad things to do. Here's what you don't do. He decides, Pilate says, okay, I've still got to honor the emperor. That's still part of my job. So, this time what he does is he has golden tribute shields made, doesn't put any images on it. So there's a sign of improvement there, no images on it. All he puts on it is the name of the emperor and his name, because he's the one who's had them made and is dedicating them. And instead of putting them somewhere public in Jerusalem, he puts them inside Herod's palace. Okay? Herod's old palace in Jerusalem. So, this is where he placed them again. This is a symbol of him trying to make himself look good and honor the emperor and gain some reputation for himself. Well, they don't find out about these shields because they're not in a public place until a few days after they've been put up. But as soon as they find out about them, there's another protest. We don't want these shields. They shouldn't be here. Now the question that Philo raises, Philo's very interesting in how he describes this. He's very clear that there was nothing to offend in terms of images on these shields, just words. What Philo doesn't tell you is that in putting the emperor's name on the shields, he would have to put the emperor's titles. And ever since Caesar Augustus, one of the titles of the emperor is Divine Son, or Son of God. Okay? So in putting the emperor's name and titles on the shield, he has actually still committed what would be considered under Jewish law blasphemy. And he's put the shields inside the palace. So again he's got a protest. Again he's got people who are very upset. This time, sons of Herod Antipas are involved in the protest as well. Okay? They go to see him, and he says, oh, for Pete's sake, I cannot remove those things now. I've made a big fuss over the fact that they are a tribute to the emperor. If I remove them, I look like a fool. I look like an idiot. I can't take them out. I'm not going to take them out. You don't have to look at them. You're not inside the palace. It makes no difference to you. I didn't put them in the city. They're not in a public place. It's just words. There's no images. What the heck are you complaining about? So they do the worst possible thing that Pilate could have done as the governor of Judea. They send a complaint to Tiberius. They go over his head. And when the complaint goes to Tiberius, Tiberius says, oh, for crying out loud, I don't need trouble in Judea. Get the shields out. Put them in my temple in Caesarea and leave them there. Thank you for the shields, Pilate. Don't want the revolt. Put them in the temple at Caesarea and leave them there. So Pilate has to back down. He has to take the shields out. He has to put them in the temple at Caesarea. At this point, if Pilate has any here, I'm sure he's a little frustrated. And then the final thing that Pilate does that we know about, Josephus tells us, isn't the Jews, it's the Samaritans. And it's the fourth big conflict. Okay, now I'm not sure historically because dating is different, but it may have happened after the time of Jesus, after the trial of Jesus. It could have happened before, but Josephus doesn't give us a particular time. He just says it's during Pilate's tenure. Okay, so a charismatic leader pops up among the Samaritans and he says, this is what we need to do, guys. Everybody follow me. We're going to Mount Gerizim, which is the mountain that the Samaritans believed was holy. And there Moses buried some vessels and some holy items and relics. And so we're going to go there. We're going to dig them up. It's going to be a grand old time. It's going to be a great religious movement, whatever. Follow me. So a whole group of Samaritans follow him. They go to a little town called Tirathana. Now here's where the record gets odd. If this is a group of Samaritans who are going to climb the mountain and find these vessels that Moses left there, why are they armed? And once they get to Tirathana, tons more Samaritans arrive. They are all armed as well. Pilate hears about it. He wasn't interfering initially, but now he's hearing that they're all armed and they're coming in swarms. He sends soldiers. Who starts the fight? Don't know, can't tell you. Josephus just tells us there is a fight. There's a battle. And the soldiers do kill some of the Samaritans. And Pilate says, that's it, round up the leaders. This is a revolt. I'm not dealing with this. He has the leaders executed. The Samaritans send another message to Tiberius. Okay? And this complaint doesn't reach Tiberius before he dies. Tiberius is dead. En route, Tiberius says, but the leadership in Rome says, bring Pilate home. We need Pilate to come home and explain what's going on over there. And that's how Pilate ends up leaving Judea. Okay? So this would come towards the end of his rule. Okay? All right, so 4 conflicts, Pilate's record. Understanding, seeing the issues that he's dealt with, right? Why have I told you all this? Because now you have sort of an idea. Okay, high priest, political issues. What's the prefect's job? What he's supposed to do? What kind of experiences has Pilate had as governor in this territory? What has he had to deal with? Okay? So now we move into, by the way, yeah, these are this is examples of, this is a regular Roman shield. This gold ornate part here would be put in the center here if it's a tribute shield, right? So it would be similar to kind of thing that Pilate might have created. And then these are just 2 images of Mount Gerizim. Okay? All right. The other thing we know Pilate did is that he clearly built some sort of a building called a Tiberium. Scholars are very, very confused as to what a Tiberium is. But nonetheless, it's called a Tiberium because it was dedicated to, whatever this building was, it was dedicated to Tiberius. Pilate built it. We're very happy that he did, because this is the historical evidence, the archaeological evidence, that the Gospels were absolutely right as to who was in power at the time and who gave the order to allow Jesus to be crucified. Okay? Because this inscription exists, because Pilate built a Tiberium and he put a dedication stone on it, saying, I built it and I was prefect. Proves him, okay? So it was founded in 1961, but basically he did actually succeed in building something that he didn't have to take down. This is a good thing. He was probably very happy. All right. So, whoever I asked to read Mark. Now we're going to look at the four Gospels, the trial narratives, and we're going to talk about what we see in the Gospels of Pilate, okay, and how he behaves. So Selena's going to read us Jesus before Pilate in the Gospel of Mark.
Like the whole thing?
Yep.
You're trying to cite the whole thing.
Like 15 verses. Okay. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called
Barabbas
was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy and the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, Crucify him. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified.
All right, so what we've heard about Pilate so far, historically, his issues. What is the only question that he is concerned with answering here in terms of his job? What's the only question he cares about?
Is that what the Jews want? Like that's what?
Well, we know that's why he caves to some degree, right? But what's the only question he asks Jesus? What's the only question he cares to ask about? In Mark's account, what is it that he's asking about? Yeah, are you a king?
Yeah.
Are you the king of the Jews? Do you claim to be a king? He cares about the political question. Don't talk to me about your religion stuff. I just want to know the political question. Do you say you're a king? Because if you say you're a king, that's treason. That's my job. Then yes, you are an enemy of Rome. I will pronounce judgment on you. Right? So he asks Jesus, and Jesus doesn't answer him. At least in Mark's account, Jesus doesn't answer him. Okay? All he's concerned with is the political question. He does try to allow Jesus a defense. So when Jesus doesn't answer, he says, don't you care? What, you're not going to answer me? Like, come on, do you hear what they're saying about you? All right, so he does try, as a Roman governor, to at least get some sort of defense out of this guy. It's Pilate's custom to release a prisoner. It was not a Roman custom. We can only assume that this developed as a result of the issues that he dealt with. He would try to, at feast times, do something to sort of keep peace, make people happy. Okay? So this is an aspect, too, kind of coming out of what we've heard that he's dealt with. All right, so the Barabbas is in prison with the insurrectionists from the uprising. What does that tell you? Because Barabbas is going to be mentioned in every one of the narratives. What does that tell you? The most obvious thing that tells you that Pilate has dealt with recently. It's right in the question. What has Pilate clearly dealt with fairly recently if he has prisoners in his prison from the insurrection?
Donna has something to say.
Yep.
I was just gonna say rebellion.
Mhm. He is currently in Jerusalem because Jerusalem's population is swollen because it is Passover. He has brought more of his troops into Jerusalem to support those who are in the Antonine fortress that are already in Jerusalem. Herod Antipas is also in Jerusalem. His guards have come with him as well. Okay? Because Jerusalem, during a feast, is a hotbed. Jerusalem, during a feast, is an uprising waiting to happen. Jerusalem, during a feast, makes Pilate very, very nervous. He needs to be in Jerusalem with his soldiers just in case. All right? So, and this tells you if he already has people in his prison who are guilty of insurrection, he's just recently dealt with an uprising. So all the more he's going to be on his guard. All the more he's going to be worried. Right? Okay. Note that Mark's account really stresses him repeating this phrase, the King of the Jews. What should I do with the King of the Jews? What's he doing with that? What is he doing with that? Is he saying that phrase seriously? What's he doing? He knows the Jewish leaders are angry. What's he doing by saying that over and over and over again? He's poking. He's poking at them. What should I do with the King of the Jews? What should I do with this one you call the king? Right? He knows they're upset. He knows they're angry. How many times has he done something and had to deal with the outcry? Now he's got a situation where they want him to do something for them. And he is in a position that he can play a little. Be a little bit more mocking towards them. He's going to use this phrase over and over in all the accounts. And it makes them angry. The crowd gets whipped up by the chief priests, right? Because of this phrase being used over and over and over again, right? Okay, so the one you call King of the Jews. Why do you want me to put him to death? What evil has he done? He wants to satisfy the crowd. Mark literally writes that. Right? He's in the palace of the Praetorium. Gee, that's exactly like what Josephus says. That's exactly like what Philo talks about. And then, of course, we know that in the titulus he puts King of the Jews, right? All right, so does Mark's Pilate match the one of history? Sounds a lot like the Pilate of history. Sounds a lot like the Pilate who's dealt with all this stuff beforehand, right? Okay, so what do the Gospels say? Matthew. Who's got Matthew?
That's me.
All right, so read Matthew.
Okay, so just as reference, this is Matthew 27, starting at 11. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At the time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas, who, when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew it was out of envy they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message: Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called Christ?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." All the people answered, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified.
All right, so again, Pilate asks the political question. It's about whether or not you say you're a king, right? Matthew's specific, it's the governor's custom. It's Pilate's custom to do this. It's not necessarily Rome's custom to do this, to release a prisoner. Which one do you want? Why? He knows they are envious, so that's what's driving them to do this. That's his interpretation of why they are responding this way. So he's in a position here, a rare position, where he's not the one who's being held at the end of a, So he's constantly referring to Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, the King of the Jews. Same thing, he's pressing buttons. But he can see he's getting nowhere. And an uprising is starting. An uproar is starting. Pilate's not a fool. He is not in a position to be able to risk full-scale revolt. Okay? So the hand washing, actually, I did look into this. The hand washing is more than just him, making a personal declaration of protest. It's actually a political symbol. He's saying, you can't go and complain at some later time, that I put this man to death. Because I am politically washing my hands of this. I am doing what you have asked me to do. I am ceding your request. I am washing my hands. This is not my choice. This is your choice. And I am doing you a favor in that sense. Okay? It's a political act, him washing his hands, as much as it is anything else. That's part of the process of what he's doing in doing that. Okay? So, does this sound like the historical Pilate we've talked about so far? Does it fit the portrait of the historical Pilate that we've read about, or that we've talked about? And the issues he's dealt with and faced and the mistakes he's made prior to this. It sounds an awful lot like him. It sounds like it fits perfectly with his situation and with what he has dealt with thus far and what he knows he cannot risk happening. Complaints have already gone to the emperor about him. Okay? All right. What the Gospels say Luke. Now, Luke has a lot more information about Pilate. First of all, in Luke 13, 1-3, we find out that Pilate killed some Galileans prior to Jesus' trial, period. And Luke actually tells us that he mingled their blood with their sacrifices. We're not 100% sure exactly what that's saying. Perhaps they were killed in the temple. Perhaps they were killed on their way to the temple. Perhaps they were killed during a feast. I don't know. But the point is, at some point, there was some sort of an altercation, and Pilate sent soldiers to deal with some Galileans who were protesting or doing something that he felt a little uncomfortable with. Okay, so we know that Pilate has done this prior. There's a confirmation in Luke of the governor's jurisdiction over taxes. This comes in Luke 20, 20-6, when the leaders come to Jesus with the question about the taxes. It says right before that, Luke prefaces that whole passage by saying that they're trying to catch him with a crime that they can then take to the governor. So this tells us, Luke is confirming for us what the historical record tells us about what the governor's jobs are. Taxes is one of his jobs. Okay? If there's a problem with that, if somebody breaks one of those rules, it's the governor that deals with it. So Luke is telling us his record matches. All right. In Luke, in the trial narrative, 3 charges are brought against Jesus, not just one. Okay, so this is how it goes. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together. And Jesus was led before them. If you are the Christ, they said, tell us. Jesus answered, if I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. They all asked, are you then the Son of God? He replied, you are right in saying I am. Then they said, why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar, and he claims to be Christ, a king. 3 charges: subverting the nation, opposes taxes, claims to be a king. Okay? So Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Doesn't bother with the taxes, doesn't bother with the subverting of the people. One question. question of political treason. Are you the king of the Jews? Is that what you're claiming? Okay? Are you the king of the Jews? Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against this man. And that's kind of a quirky thing. Jesus said, yes, it is as you say, I'm the king of the Jews. Why would Pilate dismiss Jesus saying that? Remember we went back and we talked about the classes in Rome? Okay? Jesus is a provincial Galilean. He's a nobody. There's been no actual uprising in Jerusalem of his followers. There's been no violence associated with this man. Jesus is a plebeian to all intents and purposes, standing before Pilate. And Pilate doesn't see any political issue here in terms of, has there been an uprising? Where are his followers? Do we have a potential problem here? This is the first I'm hearing of this guy. Can't be all that big of a deal, right? So, he says, I find no basis for a charge against this man, a charge of treason. All right? When they insisted, he stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here, and Pilate hears music to his ears. What? Galilee? Oh, not my jurisdiction. Nothing to do with me. Send him to Herod. Send him to Antipas. Let him deal with it. Then I don't get myself into another sticky situation with these people. Right? Send him to Herod. Let Herod deal with it. Okay? So he sends them off to Herod. Herod deals with it, so to speak. Okay, so Herod sees Jesus. Herod also finds no reason for a charge. Lets his soldiers have a little fun with Jesus, but that's it. Okay? Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people and said to them, you brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him. Scourging, by the way, was a political, it was a punishment that was used for political reasons. So it was used against people who had committed some sort of political crime, most often. It began being used on slaves, but as time went on, in terms of this type of a setting, that's the kind of crime it was used for. So when he says he'll have Jesus flogged, he'll have Jesus scourged, it's a compromise, right? I'm acknowledging there's a potential for problem here. I'll have him scourged. For crying out loud, people died of the scourging. It wasn't unusual for that to happen. So, I'll have him scourged. If he survives it, I'll release him. Okay? So I'm giving you part of what you're asking. I'm doing my job as a Roman governor. I'm kind of, making sure there's no hint of any problem here with rebellion. But then I'll release him. Okay? With one voice they cried out, away with this man, release Barabbas to us. Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city. Okay? That's how recent this is. In the city. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. For the third time he spoke to them. Why? Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him. But with loud shouts they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. Okay? He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. All right? Okay, so does this sound like the Pilate of history? It does. It's exactly the Pilate of history. It's exactly the man who got stuck with these people protesting him. It's exactly the man who had to take the standards out. It's exactly the man who had to take the shields out. It's exactly the man who's worried about having an insurrection. Another one. He's already got people in the prison for it. All right? Fourth one. John is very interesting. It's a very different account. What the Gospels say in John. Pastor Roy's going to read this one.
Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anybody," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus said. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate said. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it that you've done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You're right in saying I'm a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everybody on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. With this he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Just once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I'm bringing it out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize that I have power to set you free or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anybody who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate brought him over to them to be crucified.
All right. So, Pilate does, in John's account, Pilate does definitely argue and push harder to not have to crucify Jesus. He doesn't see a true basis for a treason charge. However, despite the fact that he believes or thinks or feels that there's no basis for a charge, the political situation and the risk he is running is so high that he caves. He has to give in. Now that doesn't mean Pilate's a saint. That doesn't mean that he, is like necessarily a friend to Jesus. It just means that he's in this situation and he might like to be able, even if we set it aside, and this is just speculation, this is just me talking here, so don't think I'm making any claims. But even if he might like or think to himself, this guy really gets under their skin. I'm kind of enjoying that. I'd like to release him. Even if that was his motivation. It doesn't matter. Even if that was his motivation. He's trying to make it so this guy is released. But as soon as they invoke that phrase, anyone who doesn't kill this man, who's claimed to be a king, is no friend of Caesar's. Ouch. That puts Pilate right in the hot seat, politically, right? Big time. We have no king but Caesar. Of course, if that kind of phrasing gets back to the emperor, and that's going to make the crowd look perfectly loyal, and it's going to make Pilate look perfectly disloyal. Okay? He cannot afford that. Cannot afford that. Not to mention the fact that you've now got a crowd that's quite whipped up into a frenzy. Like I said, he's got a prison already full of insurrectionists. And this is going on, and it's just getting more and more intense. At the end of the day, there's only one political decision to be made. Do I risk everything for the sake of what is, in effect, this Galilean provincial? Or do I just say fine, crucify him? Okay? And get it calmed down. Right? So this is what he does. If you're looking at it purely from the historical perspective, it makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. So now I come back to my original question. Is there two Pilates? The Pilate of history, supposedly, and the Pilate that's represented in the Gospels? Or do they actually match up pretty darn well? Once you know the history of Pilate, what's gone on while he's been governor, the things that he's done, the mistakes that he's made, the situation he's in, what his responsibilities are, once you have all that background, now take that Pilate and put him into the trial narratives in the Gospels. Does his actions and decisions make sense? Are they historically a perfect match to what we see in the non-canonical texts of this person? And they are. It's a perfect match. He is literally the right man in the right position during exactly the right political tensions, with exactly the right political responsibilities, and even, you could argue, the mistakes that he's made prior to this point set him up to be easily pushed in this situation. Interesting, isn't it? That the history is so perfectly in line with what the gospel record tells us. Right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not writing about some version of Pilate that doesn't fit with the historical record. It fits perfectly. Alright? So Jesus dies for political reasons, for historical reasons, for theological reasons, and the Gospels reflect all three. All three of your bases are covered. And they all kind of come to roost in that situation with Pilate. So it's easy, like I said, we grow up with this idea, he's a villain. And I'm not saying he isn't. I'm not saying he was a nice guy. I'm not saying he was, someone you wanted to be your best bud, right? Go and hang out with Pilate on a Friday night. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying here is keep in mind the whole context, because all of that context is present in those trial narratives. It's all there, and the gospel writers have put it all there for us to see, once you understand the history. All right. So that would be the end of what I have to say. Being a historian, I thought, you know what, there's a whole lot of research that's gone into this, so I should probably list my sources just in case. Not that I expect anybody to check up on them, but I'm just saying, they're all there. If you want to go and read more or find out more, I can give you names and articles and books and whatever. Any questions? I don't know if I covered everything reasonably well, but any questions on Pilate or the situation, or no? We're good.
Which you mentioned Parthia earlier, right? Where is that?
So that would be to the north. Well, northeast,
Okay.
above Syria.
Okay.
Right. So the border that runs northeast to the east. That whole border. Sorry, I'm facing you instead of standing. If the map was here, and you saw in the why don't I just put the map up? Because that would make a lot more sense. By the way, that was a scourge, a Roman scourge in that one image. Nasty things. Horrific things. Okay, give me my small province, big headache. There it is. Okay. So you've got this whole area up here would be the Parthians.
Do you possibly know how far east it's stretched?
Geography isn't my thing. I know basics. So I know northeast, you got your Parthians. That's basically what I can tell you. I can look it up actually if you want. I can find you the actual border distance and how many miles it would have gone. But I know that the Parthians, I don't know how much history you guys know about Mark Antony and Julius Caesar and things like that, but Julius Caesar died. His next great campaign that he wanted to fight before he was murdered was actually he was preparing to fight the Parthians. That was what he wanted to do. Because they were a constant problem to Rome. And Rome didn't like the fact that they had this massive territory. It was very wealthy. And they wanted it. Rome wanted to annex it. So Julius Caesar, that was his next big, task. He gets murdered. So then there's the triumvirate, there's Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, and they go and hunt down the people who killed Julius Caesar. And then Mark Antony goes to Egypt, and him and Cleopatra who do their whole thing. And Cleopatra helps him to build up a fleet, etc., not only to take on Octavian, which is ultimately what ends up happening, but also because Mark Antony basically takes the mantle of Caesar. And he, as a great Roman general, is going to take on Parthia. That's his goal. He's going to take up Parthia. Well, of course, he doesn't make it. He's trounced by Octavian. And Octavian, although Octavian was a brilliant emperor, first emperor of Rome, he was not a warrior. He left the fighting to other people. Octavian had a habit of always getting very sick right before a battle. Very ill. Had to be carried off the battlefield, and somebody else would have to fight for him. So he was not really a warrior. Parthia was something they wanted purely for the wealth. But Octavian wasn't a warrior. And he had other issues. He was concerned with domestic issues, with getting the empire running like a well-oiled machine. So that's what he did. So by the time Tiberius is on the throne, Tiberius is also interested in keeping the empire that already exists together, not necessarily conquering more territory. Nonetheless, Parthia has been kind of a burr in the saddle of Rome for a long time. They don't want Parthia coming into Syria before they're ready to take them on. And they certainly don't want Parthia coming into Syria with only a few legions in Syria. They want to know that they can wipe it out. Right?
Thank you. Your presentation was excellent and provided excellent background to what we have in the Bible. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Angela, that little, the archaeological discovery with Pilate's name on it was really good. Just a great credibility evidence for Scripture. You were talking about all the tetrarchs there a while ago, and it reminded me of Luke chapter 3, beginning at verse 1, where Luke writes, "In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip tetrarch of the region of Etruria, and Trachonitis and some other dude tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas." How Luke just roots the events of John the Baptist's emergence on the scene in that historical context of all those names that you mentioned are sourced in other non-biblical sources. So just a great affirmation of the credibility of Scripture.
Yeah,
So very good.
Luke as a Greek would have been very much versed in the Greco-Roman history tradition and the Greco-Roman biography tradition. So his biography begins with a prologue, or his account of the life of Christ begins with a prologue in the same way as a Greco-Roman biography would begin. Or a Greco-Roman historical account would begin. And he also constantly, continually roots everything he's saying within historical markers. That is something, although there are similar historical markers mentioned throughout the other three Gospels, Luke is very unique for this. Because he is really rooted, because he's not a Jew, he is rooted in that tradition and that education. So his Gospel is filled with giving you very specific markers. Who's governing? What territory am I talking about? Who's in power at this time? What year it is? He's right on that, boy.
And then probably because he was a physician, more educated, probably.
Yeah,
Yeah.
He would have had, but I mean, when we think physician, we think differently. Like, yes,
Yeah.
he was a doctor. Yes, he would have been, a healer in that sense. But a doctor wasn't just a medical thing. He would have also been very well educated in philosophy, right? Like philosophy, history, all of those things,
exactly.
right?
That's what I meant,
Yeah. So he's got the whole kit and caboodle, because that's the Greco-Roman methodology for education anyway, right?
Yeah.
The whole thing, not just one. Yeah. So for sure, his gospel in particular is actually very good for that. All right, that's it. Y'all are free to go. The bell has rung. Class is out.
But we're happy we never got a text.
No test. No test.
Yeah.